Welcome. You found your way to a quiet place, a corner of the night where we move more slowly and let the noise of the surface world fade. This channel is a shared vessel for calm journeys into the deep ocean, into hidden layers of our planet that most of us will never see but can still imagine. Stories shaped by depth, pressure, time, and long stretches of silence. And if you'd like to return to this place again, a quiet like or subscription helps keep these slow journeys afloat. For now, make yourself comfortable, and let's begin our descent. This is the boundary we'll visit together tonight, a kind of invisible shoreline made not of rock or sand, but of pressure. A hidden border in the water beneath the North Pole, where submarines hesitate, where our machines grow fragile, and where the ocean begins to feel like something else entirely. We won't rush there. We'll drift toward it, gently tracing how the ice above, the cold world below, and the limits of steel and human breath all meet at this quiet, dangerous line. And as we move toward that pressure zone, we'll keep the pace soft and soothing, like a slow dive rather than a plunge, so that even as the numbers climb and the water grows heavier, you can stay relaxed and maybe even a little sleepy while the deep opens beneath us. A hidden border where submarines dare not go. So as we sink in our minds beneath that drifting lid of ice, make yourself comfortable again, because somewhere down there, in the dark water under the North Pole, there is a depth where our machines quietly give up, and the ocean, in a very real way, begins. Not a cliff we can see, not a painted line on some underwater map, but a soft, invisible frontier that every submarine captain knows is there. We often picture submarines as unstoppable, sleek, nuclear-powered, slipping silently through the deep, able to go almost anywhere, almost forever. But each one carries hidden in its steel skin a very specific limit. With every 10 meters they descend, the pressure outside climbs by about 1 atmosphere, another full weight of the air above the entire Earth, stacked on the hull, again and again. At a few hundred meters, that weight is already far beyond what our own bodies could ever tolerate without protection. Now, picture what happens as we keep going down. For a modern military submarine, the safe or test depth might be 300 to 600 meters, a comfortable buffer above a crush depth that is carefully calculated, closely guarded, and not actually that much deeper. Below that, the numbers on the depth gauge are no longer just information. They are warning signs. The hull does not bend gracefully. It fails suddenly. Under open ocean, a captain can always imagine rising, turning, escaping upward into air and light if something goes wrong. Beneath Arctic ice, that comfort disappears. The ceiling is not empty sky but a shifting roof of frozen water, scarred with pressure ridges where slabs of ice have collided and stacked into walls many meters thick. A submarine here must stay shallow enough and lucky enough to find a thin place to break through in an emergency. Going deep means not just more pressure from the water below, but less hope from the ice above. So there is a band, a kind of hidden border, where routine travel stops. Above it, patrols, exercises like the Navy's under-ice campaigns, cautious surfacings through narrow leads. Below it, the ocean hardens into something else, a wall of pressure that turns the idea of a fast, maneuverable submarine into a fragile fantasy. We're going to other planets with probes. We send robots to the bottom of trenches like the Malloy Deep, at over 5,000 meters, yet we still cannot move freely through vast regions beneath the polar surface. It isn't for lack of courage or imagination. It's because steel, titanium, electronics, and human lungs all share the same basic weakness when the water grows too heavy. To understand why that border exists, and why the Arctic makes it even harsher, we'll need to slow your thoughts. Follow me into the quiet details of pressure itself, the way we build a hull to resist it, and the strange, hostile shape of the polar ocean. And that is where our next step takes us. You, your room, and the Arctic abyss, Before we dive into those numbers and hulls and limits, we're going to pause for a moment at a much quieter boundary, one that starts right where you are. Make yourself comfortable if you haven't already, and let your attention drift just a little away from the screen and into the room around you. Notice where you're listening from. Maybe you're in bed, sinking slowly into a mattress that remembers the shape of your day, or on a couch with a blanket gathered around your legs, or taking a brief secret break in the soft hum of a night shift. Wherever you are, let your eyes move, or simply imagine them moving to the nearest wall, the ceiling above you, the floor beneath your feet. Now picture what happens when you pay attention to the air itself. Is it warm and a little heavy, the kind of warmth that makes you drowsy? Or is there a faint chill on your skin, a reminder that somewhere a window does not quite seal, or a heater has just clicked off? If it feels safe to do so, you might rest your hand on the bedsheet, the arm of the chair, the edge of the desk, and notice the temperature there, the quiet, familiar contact with the surface that holds you up. Above the Arctic Ocean, the air is doing something very different. Out on the pack ice, far from any town or road, the temperature can fall far below freezing, cold enough that every breath feels like glass, cold enough that exposed skin begins to protest almost at once. The sea below, that air is only slightly kinder, its salt water hovering just above the freezing point, a dark, restless skin of liquid pressed against a lid of ice that can stretch unbroken to the horizon. We often picture the poles as empty white deserts, but they are also vast refrigerators, slowly pulling heat out of the world. The snow there does not feel like the gentle wet flakes of a city storm. It is dry, sharp, and eager to steal warmth from anything living. Imagine trading the ceiling above you for a roof made of that ice, meters thick, ridged and cracked, shifting with tides and wind, so that instead of plaster or wood, there is only a pale, dim glow, and then solid, ancient cold. Do you tend to seek out warm beaches, where the sand holds the day's heat long after sunset? Or do you secretly prefer snowy nights, when sound is muffled and the world feels smaller, closer? How does it feel to imagine your room drifting under that frozen ceiling? Your familiar lamp replaced by the faint blue light that filters through Arctic ice. Your window looking not onto a street or a garden, but onto a frozen plain where no tree or house breaks the line of the earth. If you find yourself enjoying these slow journeys into hidden places, these quiet walks along the edge between your world and the deep, liking the video or subscribing helps keep this small, dimly lit corner of the internet glowing. Not because numbers matter very much here, but because each gesture tells the algorithms that there should still be a calm space for long thoughts, late at night. There is no urgency, and certainly no pressure, to do anything at all. This is an open invitation, not a demand. You are welcome to simply rest, to slow your thoughts, to let the suggestions pass by like distant flows of ice, and stay exactly as you are, because just beneath that imagined ceiling of frozen sea, the water is waiting. Black and cold and heavy, and in a moment will follow me down through it, toward the place where submarines falter and the true pressure of the polar ocean begins, drifting northward, slipping into journey mode. So before we sink any farther into that black, cold water, make yourself comfortable in the simplest, most physical way you can. If you're lying down, ease your head a little deeper into the pillow, feel the fabric cradle the back of your skull, and let your shoulders drop away from your ears. If you're sitting, soften the way you're holding yourself upright, as if the chair or the bed or the floor is doing just a bit more of the work for you. Notice your jaw, how often it stays clenched without being asked, and see what happens if you let it loosen, just slightly, so your teeth are no longer pressed together. Let your tongue rest heavy. Let the muscles around your eyes stop trying to read the room. We're going to take one slow breath in and one even slower breath out, and with that exhale, you can let your thoughts drift outward, like small pieces of ice moving away from a breaking glacier. Now, Instead of going straight down, follow me in another direction first. Imagine a globe lit softly from one side, the familiar shapes of continents picked out in faint color beneath a thin sheen of ocean blue. We often picture the Arctic as a flat white cap on top of this sphere. But for a moment, trace a slow, patient arc with your mind, leaving the coasts you know, slipping northward over darkening seas, past shipping lanes and fishing grounds, and the last scattered islands. As you drift toward that pale crown of the planet, the time scale around you begins to stretch. The ice ahead is not just this winter's freeze. It is the shifting sum of thousands of years of growth and melt, flows colliding, ridges piling up, snow compressing into solid ancient layers. Beneath that, the basin of the Arctic Ocean has been here for millions of years, a deep, waiting bowl in the stone of the earth, holding water that has been circulating, cooling, sinking, and rising since long before our species learned to cross even a river. From far away on a map, this region looks almost empty, a blank white circle at the top of the page, as if there is nothing to say about it. But it is not a blank, and it is not simple. It is one of Earth's last true frontiers, especially when we stop looking across the surface and start looking down, through the ice, into the world beneath it. Now, picture what happens when we do that. Under the frozen lid, the ocean is not an open swimming pool of cold, clear water. It is layered and structured, bands of different temperatures and densities sliding past one another, currents twisting slowly in the dark, and over all of it, the steady increase of pressure, one extra atmosphere for every 10 meters we descend, stacking up invisibly until it becomes a solid, crushing presence. Somewhere in that thickness, our submarines reach their quiet limit, the depth beyond which their hulls, their sensors, their very design can no longer follow. And below that invisible line, the Arctic keeps going, into a pressurized world where technology and nature face one another in a kind of stalemate, each waiting to see which will yield first. In a moment, we'll follow that line down and meet the border where the idea of a submarine begins to unravel. The white illusion, what we think the North Pole looks like. So before we follow that line down into the dark, we need to pause at the very top of the world, on the part we think we understand. We often picture the North Pole as something almost childlike in its simplicity, a kind of symbol more than a real place, and that picture quietly shapes everything we assume about what lies beneath. Make yourself comfortable for a moment, and imagine the classic scene, an endless level sheet of white ice stretching flat to every horizon, a lonely striped pole, or a small flag marking the exact top of the Earth. Maybe a single polar bear in the distance, or a quiet research tent glowing under a pale blue sky. The air is still, the world is clean, and the surface feels calm, almost empty. It is a beautiful image. It is also almost entirely wrong for our purposes, because that smooth white lid hides nearly everything that matters in this story. The thickness of the ice, the way it buckles and shatters, the cold black water below, and the pressure building with every meter of depth. From above, it looks like a frozen floor. From below, it is more like a moving ceiling made of broken glass. Now picture what happens when the wind and currents push that sea ice around, year after year. The pieces do not glide past each other politely. They collide, they tilt, they pile up. Slabs of ice can crumple and stack into jagged pressure ridges, rising several meters into the air and plunging tens of meters down into the water, like the buried keel of a ship. Between them, thin sheets of new ice skim over open leads that may vanish again within hours. The Arctic pack is not a single plate, it is a restless mosaic. This is the first illusion we have to slow your thoughts around, the idea of a smooth, static lid. Even the ice itself is a wandering, grinding glacier spread out over the ocean, a floating cousin of the great ice sheets on land. It grows and melts, fractures and welds, forever rearranging the safe and unsafe places where anything beneath might hope to rise. And under that shifting ceiling, the seafloor falls away into a hidden world that looks nothing like the flat map in our heads. Deep basins, such as the Malloy Deep Sink, to more than 5.5 kilometers, continental slopes drop steeply from the shallow shelves, and cold, dense currents thread through trenches and ridges in a darkness that has lasted for millions of years. The Arctic Ocean is not shallow just because the ice on top feels close. Here is the pattern interrupt. From above, the North Pole feels like a dot you could step on. From below, it is a maze of moving roofs over an uneven, deeply carved sea, and just as the surface misleads us, our quiet mental picture of a submarine gliding freely under that ice is its own gentle illusion. We're going to have to take that image apart, piece by piece, to see what really happens when steel, ice, and pressure meet in the deep. The dark cathedral, imagining the under-ice world. So, let's set that neat silver submarine aside for a moment, and the tidy diagrams of hulls and depth gauges with it. Before we talk about steel and limits and what breaks first, we're going to ask you to become something much simpler. Make yourself comfortable, slow your thoughts, and follow me into a different way of seeing this hidden world. Imagine that you are not in a vessel at all, not wrapped in metal or instruments, but reduced to a single point of awareness, hanging weightless in the cold water beneath the Arctic ice. There is no floor under you, no sky above you, only a feeling that somewhere overhead there must be a surface, and somewhere far below there must be a deep, unseen earth. We often picture the underside of the ice as a smooth white ceiling, like the flat bottom of a frozen lake in a storybook. It is not that. It is jagged and sculpted, carved by years of freezing and melting and grinding, a landscape turned upside down. Great keels of ice hang down from pressure ridges where flows have collided, plunging like frozen stalactites, some only a few meters long, others reaching tens of meters into the water. Between these hanging structures, there are corridors and chambers, narrow slots where the ice almost touches the sea, and then sudden openings where it lifts away and a small, dim cavern of water appears. In some places, the gap between ice and ocean is barely higher than a room in a house. In others, it is a tall, shadowed hall that drops away into hundreds or even thousands of meters of abyss, the Arctic basin falling off beneath your invisible feet. Around you, it is almost entirely dark. Any daylight that manages to filter through meters of snow and ice becomes a pale, greenish suggestion rather than a true light, quickly swallowed by the water. Instead, the brightness comes in pinpoints and brief ghosts. The soft glow of an instrument on a distant vehicle, the blue-white flicker of a tiny bioluminescent creature, the slow pulse of something drifting in the black. Sound, in this cold, dense water, behaves strangely. A distant crack in the ice, or the muted hum of a ship far away, seems to slide past you and keep going, carrying for kilometers. Now, picture what happens as we let that point of awareness sink. 10 meters, 20, 50. With each step downward, the water presses a little harder, the weight of everything above you adding up. Somewhere far below this dark cathedral of ice, the numbers become so large, the pressure so intense that the very idea of a conventional submarine starts to unravel. Where is that invisible boundary, and what exactly happens when we try to cross it? Stating the core problem. At that invisible boundary, something important changes. Not in the numbers on a gauge, but in what this cold, hidden world will actually allow us to do. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts, because what we're going to talk about now is not just unexplored water, but water that for us might as well be sealed away. We often picture a map of the Earth with blank spaces waiting to be filled in, as if all we need is time and better machines. Yet under the Arctic ice, the problem is quieter and more final than that. It is not simply that we haven't gone there yet. It is that, with the submarines we have, we cannot go there in any sustained, useful way. Not because we lack courage, but because ice and pressure together redraw the rules. Imagine a submarine sliding beneath the polar surface, a narrow metal shell between the crew and hundreds of meters of cold, heavy water. Above it, the ice is not a smooth ceiling, but a broken, drifting roof with pressure ridges stacked 10 or even 20 meters thick. Below it, every 10 meters of depth adds another atmosphere of pressure, another invisible hand pushing inward on every bolt, every weld, every windowless plate of steel or titanium. Now picture what happens as that submarine tries to dive. It cannot simply sink until it reaches the interesting places. It must stay in a narrow band, deep enough that it does not scrape the jagged ice underside, shallow enough that the hull is not pushed past its design limit. Most military submarines are built to operate in the hundreds of meters, not the thousands. Their true crush depths are secret, but they are not magical. There is a point where the metal yields, and beyond that point, there is no second chance. As we push toward that limit, the difficulty does not rise gently. It rises almost like a wall. Hull stress grows. Tiny flaws become dangerous. Moving parts that work perfectly in a warm harbor begin to stiffen, jam, or leak under polar pressure and cold. And all the while, the crew knows that an emergency ascent is no longer a simple escape. The ice above may be too thick to break, too chaotic to trust. There might be no opening at all. In this way, the environment seems to erase our attempts. It crushes experimental hulls that reach too far, squeezes seals until they fail, locks hatches behind a frozen ceiling, and turns the idea of a quick retreat into a slow, careful search for a patch of thinner ice. We can send small research craft deeper for short visits, but they move slowly, carry almost no people, and cannot roam freely under this shifting roof. So we arrive at the core mystery of this place, the quiet statement that guides the rest of our journey. Beneath the polar ice, there is a pressure zone where, for all practical purposes, the ocean stops being a place for submarines at all. To understand the wall, we must first feel the weight. To understand that quiet border, this pressure zone where submarines simply stop, we first have to turn our attention from the machine to the water itself, to what the ocean is doing to that hull, molecule by molecule. So make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts, because we're going to sit with something invisible and surprisingly heavy: the weight of the sea. We often picture the ocean as just more water the farther down you go, a kind of endless swimming pool that simply gets darker and colder. But the ocean is not only depth, it is weight. And that weight presses on every square centimeter of metal, every window, every seal. On the surface, here on this small strip of earth where we live and breathe, we already carry 1 atmosphere of pressure on our skin, about 14.7 pounds on every square inch, held up quietly by the air above us for years and years. We don't notice it, because the pressure inside our bodies pushes back. Still, we know the feeling of added weight. Imagine a thick winter blanket settling over you, layer after layer, until your chest feels gently pinned. Or the way, when you dive just a few meters beneath the surface of a pool or a cold lake, your ears begin to ache and your chest feels just a little tighter. That's what pressure is. Weight spread out over area, a soft hand at first, then a firm grip, then something far less forgiving. Now picture what happens when we trade that pool for the deep Arctic Ocean. The rule of thumb is simple, almost disarmingly so. Every 10 meters you descend, the pressure increases by about 1 atmosphere. 10 meters, 2 atmospheres, 20 meters, 3. By 100 meters, the water and air together are pressing with roughly 10 times the weight you feel at the surface. By 300 to 600 meters, where many military submarines set their quiet test limits, that invisible blanket has become dozens of atmospheres thick. The key is that it never lets up. Each extra 10 meters adds another full atmosphere, another 14.7 pounds on every square inch of hull. stacking and stacking with no empty space, no pause, no mercy. Beneath the polar ice, where the water can plunge to thousands of meters, the pressure climbs into the hundreds of atmospheres, turning the deep into a kind of cold, invisible wall. Not just more water, but a world of weight. Follow me just a little further in thought, because this is where that simple rule becomes a boundary. Steel, titanium, the complex alloys that make up a submarine's shell, and the fragile humans inside can only push back so much before they yield. Somewhere below the last safe number on the depth gauge, that steady increase in pressure stops being a feeling and becomes a limit. In the next section, we'll move slowly through how engineers chase that limit and why, under the ice, the ocean so often wins. Layer by layer, how ocean pressure builds with depth. Somewhere below that last safe number on the dial, the ocean stops feeling like a place we visit and starts to feel like a weight we can barely imagine. To understand why that boundary is so hard and so unforgiving, we're going to slow down and move through the water layer by layer, almost as if we could feel the pressure building on our own skin. Make yourself comfortable for a moment at the surface. Up here, standing on the deck of a ship or on the ice itself, your body quietly carries 1 atmosphere of pressure from the air, about 14.5 pounds pressing on every square inch of you, all the time, from every direction. We don't notice it because we grew up inside it, the way a glacier grows inside its own cold weight, year after year, until the burden simply feels like the way the world is. Now, picture what happens as we slip just 10 meters down, beneath the surface, into the dim blue. In that short distance, the water adds another full atmosphere, another 14.5 pounds on every square inch. We often picture the sea as light and flowing, but in pressure, it's as if the entire weight of a small car has been gently lowered onto a patch of hull the size of a dinner plate, not with a crash, but with a steady, implacable settling. Follow me deeper, to 50 meters. Recreational divers rarely go this far, and for good reason. Down here, the pressure is around 6 atmospheres in total, air plus water together. If you could somehow stack people instead of water, it would feel like a tower of friends 4 or 5 high standing on your shoulders, all their weight focused onto a space the size of a postage stamp. The water itself remains soft to the touch, but the numbers begin to whisper that we are not meant to stay. At 100 meters, where only trained technical divers and the hardiest submersibles wander, the pressure has climbed to about 11 atmospheres, roughly 160 pounds on every square inch. Imagine a neat stack of compact cars, 3 or 4 of them, perfectly balanced on a single book in a quiet library. The book does not scream or crack, it simply endures, or it doesn't. That's what a submarine hull feels, silently, over every rivet, every weld, every window frame. And still, water does something subtle and strange. It does not crush in one direction like a falling rock. Because it is almost incompressible, especially in this cold polar world, it transmits that pressure evenly from every side, from above, beneath, and all around. So the hull lives inside a kind of invisible stone that happens to flow. Long before we reach 1,000 meters, human divers are gone. Only metal and engineering can go on. But each extra 100 meters is no small step. It is another car on the stack, another invisible library floor of books, another layer of the earth itself pressing in. Somewhere ahead, just beyond the depths we've imagined so far, lies the point where even the strongest designs begin to fail, and where the ocean under the ice demands a very different kind of vessel altogether. What a submarine really is, a bubble fighting the ocean. So when we talk about that point where even the strongest designs begin to fail, we're really talking about something very simple and strangely fragile. We often picture a submarine as a solid, invincible block of metal carving through the cold dark like a knife. But follow me for a moment and turn that image inside out. Imagine you could peel away the outer skin of a submarine and set it gently to one side. What you'd be left with, in its purest form, is a hollow shell, a hard bubble of air surrounded on all sides by water that is trying patiently and relentlessly to squeeze it smaller. Not a fortress, but a protected pocket of the same easy-breathing pressure you and I feel here at the surface. Inside that outline we see in photographs, there is usually a second, more secret shape: the pressure hull. It is not sleek or decorative. It is often a simple cylinder, sometimes with spherical sections at the ends, because those curves share the load of the ocean evenly, guiding the force around the metal instead of letting it dent in one cruel spot. Now picture what happens as the submarine sinks and the water above grows deeper and heavier with each passing meter. Every 10 meters or so, the pressure outside climbs by about 1 atmosphere, another full layer of weight pressing on every square centimeter of that hull. After a few hundred meters, the difference between the world inside and the world outside has become enormous. The metal has to hold that entire invisible mountain back. If the hull is too thin, it crumples like an empty can. If it is too thick, the submarine becomes heavy, clumsy, and difficult to move or to lift back toward the light. Most modern military submarines live their working lives in a narrow band within this balance. Their exact limits are carefully hidden, but their safe operating depths are measured in a few hundred meters, not in thousands, deep enough that the surface feels very far away, nowhere near the deepest shadows of the Arctic basins. Here is the pattern interrupt. We can send tiny spacecraft past the icy moons of the outer planets. Yet the Malloy Deep in the Arctic Ocean, dropping to more than 5,500 meters, might as well be another planet for these vessels. Under the North Pole, beneath drifting ice and thick pressure ridges, our proud submarines only skim the upper skin of the ocean, tracing paths through a thin habitable film. So when we imagine them slipping under polar ice, it helps to slow your thoughts and see them not as masters of that hidden world, but as careful guests. Each hull is a negotiated truce between strength and weight, between the soft air inside and the hard sea outside, moving through a cold place on Earth where, just a little farther down, the pressure would erase the very idea of a submarine altogether. Test depth, crush depth, and the invisible red line, and that idea of erasure, of a machine simply ceasing to belong in the water around it, is not just poetic language, it's built into the numbers that every submarine carries like a quiet secret. As we make yourself comfortable with those numbers, we're going to slow your thoughts and look at two depths that define the thin strip of ocean where a hull is allowed to exist. The first is called test depth. We often picture that as a hard limit, a cliff edge, but in reality, it is more like the top of a well-marked path on a mountain, the highest point where the designers and the Navy have agreed the boat may wander in its daily life. At test depth, the pressure outside is already enormous, hundreds of meters beneath the surface, tens of times greater than the air resting on our shoulders here on Earth. Yet the steel or titanium or composite shell is still behaving the way the engineers expect. Inside that number, there is a safety margin, a cushion. The people who draw these hulls know that the sea is not a tidy laboratory, so they design for more than the crew will ever be allowed to see. And that brings us to the second number, quieter, more ominous, crush depth. This is the estimated point at which the hull would fail catastrophically, where 1 more meter of depth would turn slow elastic bending into sudden collapse. Now, picture what happens as you approach that line in your mind. Every extra 10 meters adds another atmosphere of pressure, another invisible weight the structure has to carry. No captain is meant to go there. In real operations, no Navy plans a dive that even brushes that boundary, because beyond it, the ocean stops feeling like a fluid you can move through and starts to feel like a solid wall of pressure pushing in from every side. The true values for both test depth and crush depth on military submarines are carefully classified, not because they reach into some unimaginable abyss, but because knowing them would reveal how strong and how vulnerable those boats really are. Still, we can say this much. We are talking about hundreds of meters, not thousands. A modern attack submarine might be certified somewhere in the range of 300 to 600 meters, perhaps with a crush depth some fraction deeper, but not 5 times, not 10 times. Between those two numbers is an invisible red line, a tightrope stretching through the cold water beneath the ice, with buoyancy pulling the boat up, pressure tugging it down, and human caution insisting that it stay in the safe middle. Imagine that tightrope drawn across the shallow shelves of the Arctic, then extended out over its true basins, where the seafloor drops to 5,000 meters and more. What would it mean to bring a machine comfortable at a few hundred meters into an ocean that is 5 or 10 times deeper? Under a frozen ceiling it cannot easily break. In the next part, we'll follow that question downward into places where even our bravest hulls have never been. Under ice, up is not always an option. So now we follow that question downward, but before we sink too far, we have to pause and look up, because under the polar ice, even the idea of up begins to change. We often picture the ocean as a vast open volume, and if something goes wrong, a submarine simply points its nose toward the lightless sky and rushes for the surface, trading crushing pressure for air. In most of the world's oceans, that escape route is always there in principle, even if it is risky, even if it means a violent emergency ascent that rattles every bolt and bends every rule. The crew can gamble, rise fast, blow the ballast tanks, let the lighter water above peel the deep off their hull. The surface is a promise. If they can reach it, the water's weight falls away. Now picture what happens when that promise is replaced by a ceiling. Not a thin film of waves, but a solid shifting roof of ice, sometimes only a meter or two thick, sometimes stacked into tens of meters of frozen mass that no steel hull can punch through. Under the Arctic ice cap, the surface is no longer a simple boundary between water and air. It is a cold, irregular lid, drifting, colliding, grinding slowly over the deep. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and imagine being inside a submarine in that world. Above you is not freedom, but a glacier-like shell, a hidden architecture of slabs and blocks and ridges. You can hear the soft creaks and distant booms as ice floes press against each other. Somewhere up there might be a thin spot or a narrow lead of open water, but somewhere else there is ice as hard as rock, pressing down. Where two flows meet and crush, they do not simply slide past. They buckle. They pile up into pressure ridges, chaotic walls on the surface, and deep keels beneath, like the roots of mountains made of ice. Those keels can stab downward many meters into the water column, forming a jagged maze of safe and unsafe ascent paths. A submarine rising blindly could find not air, but an unbreakable barrier. Because of this, under-ice operations become an exercise in careful listening and patient mapping. During the US Navy's ICEX exercises, submarines thread their way through this hidden world, using sonar to search for thin ice or open leads where they can safely pierce the surface. Something as simple as "let's go up" turns into a slow, methodical hunt, where a mistake might mean being trapped beneath a frozen roof. And when up is uncertain, down feels very different. Every extra meter of depth adds pressure, another invisible hand tightening around the hull, yet the crew knows that racing upward is no longer a guaranteed escape. The comfortable band of depths they dare to inhabit narrows, squeezed between ice above and limits of steel below. So what happens when we ask our machines to work at the very edge of that band, in places where even a small error could mean there is nowhere left to go? In the next part, we'll step right onto that invisible ledge, a narrow band of safety suspended in black water. So let's step onto that ledge together, but this time, make yourself comfortable in your chair or in your bed, because we're going to stretch that narrow feeling into a picture you can really hold in your mind. Not as a diagram in a textbook, but as a quiet three-layered world of ice, water, and rock stacked above and below us in the dark. Imagine a simple cross-section of the Arctic. At the very top, a rough white ceiling of sea ice broken by ridges and pressure folds, some of them rising 10 or 15 meters above the waterline and plunging just as far beneath the surface. Far below, the basin floor curves away into the deep, dropping not just hundreds but thousands of meters toward places like the Malloy Deep, more than 5.5 kilometers down. Between those two extremes, somewhere in the black water, is a thin horizontal band where a submarine can move with something like confidence. Now, picture what happens if we try to draw that band to scale. We often picture submarines roaming freely through a vast vertical column of ocean, but under the ice, it is more like a ribbon. A few tens of meters below the lowest ice keels, where an emergency rise would not slam the hull into frozen slabs, down to perhaps a few hundred meters above the test depth marked quietly in the ship's manuals, where the pressure is still fierce, but not yet intolerable. Above that ribbon, the danger is not abstract. It is the very real possibility of colliding with hidden ice, or discovering at the worst possible moment that there is simply no thin spot to break through to air. Below it, the danger changes character. Every extra 10 meters adds roughly another atmosphere of pressure, another invisible hand squeezing the steel. Somewhere past the test depth, long before the true crush depth, the crew knows they are trespassing into a region where the safety margins they have trusted for years begin to erode. It is not that the water becomes different, but that the ocean's weight finally stops negotiating. So this safe zone becomes, in practice, an invisible tunnel wrapped around the Arctic basin, a continuous, gently curving corridor that patrols and research missions must carefully remain within. It does not cling to the seafloor, and it does not brush the ice. It hangs in the middle like a suspended path, shifting as ice thickens, thins, and ridges drift with the wind. Follow me along that tunnel, and you can almost feel the constraints pressing in from both directions. A cold ceiling above, a colder, heavier world beneath. And beyond that band, down in the deeper polar basins, lies a realm that is, for now, effectively off-limits to crude submarines, a true pressure-dominated ocean that feels closer to another planet than to the familiar seas at Earth's surface. In the next part, we'll see how we try to send other kinds of machines into that forbidden space, and what happens when even they begin to fail. Feeling the squeeze, how steel and titanium respond to depth. So before we send those other machines down into that forbidden space, we need to slow our thoughts and sit with something very simple and very unforgiving. The hull itself. We often picture a submarine as a kind of underwater airplane, a sleek shape slicing through the cold dark, but in the deep polar basins, it is less a vehicle and more a shield, holding back an entire ocean that is trying, patiently, to get in. Imagine that pressure not as a gentle, even squeeze, but as a restless search. It flows over the curved steel or titanium, it seeps around hatches and along welds, and it hunts for every tiny imperfection, every place where the metal is a little thinner, a little rougher, a little more stressed than its neighbors. Now, picture what happens when that invisible force finds such a spot. The load that was spread over the whole hull concentrates there, like snow from a wide field sliding into one narrow crevasse beneath a glacier. Steel and titanium are, in many ways, wonderfully suited to this hidden world. Under compression, they can bear forces that would crush concrete, and for years they can endure the steady rise of pressure as a boat dives from the surface toward the deep. But they are not limitless. Push them beyond a certain point, and they no longer deform gracefully. They wrinkle, they buckle, they crack along microscopic lines, and when they fail, they often fail suddenly, not because the entire hull was weak, but because one small region reached its breaking point first. We're going to linger for a moment on a tempting idea. Why not just make the hull thicker? Add more steel, more titanium, more safety. The ocean, however, charges a price for every extra centimeter. A thicker hull is heavier, so the vessel needs more buoyancy just to float, which means a larger body pushing through the water, more drag, more power. Inside, the walls eat into the living space, shrinking the already small volume where people and instruments can exist in air instead of water. Under ice, the trade-offs become even sharper. A heavy, thick-walled submarine does not rise quickly, and when the ceiling above you is not open sky but a shifting roof of sea ice and pressure ridges, that sluggishness matters. Maneuvering to a thin spot to break through the surface becomes harder. Forcing a path through thicker ice becomes more dangerous. The very armor that protects you from the deep can trap you beneath the frozen skin of the earth. There are craft that choose armor over almost everything else. Specialized deep diving vehicles, like bathyscaphes and modern full ocean depth spheres, use enormously thick, usually spherical pressure hulls. The sphere spreads pressure evenly, like a perfect bubble of air held within the sea, and some of these machines have touched trenches far deeper than any polar basin. But they move slowly. They carry only 1 or 2 people, and they have almost no room for the complex systems a roaming under-ice submarine needs. So a quiet question lingers in the dark water beneath the ice. If we can build these nearly invincible deep-diving spheres, why can't we simply turn them into practical, agile under-ice submarines that wander the polar basins like ships on the surface world? The answer lies not only in the hull, but in everything that has to live inside it, and in the moving ceiling of ice above. Submarines, 2 very different creatures. So when we imagine those nearly invincible spheres, we might feel a quiet temptation to think the problem is already solved, that somewhere in a lab, a true under-ice abyss submarine is almost ready to slide into the cold water and disappear beneath the polar ice. But the machines that have actually touched the deepest places on Earth are very different creatures from the long, sleek shadows that patrol the upper ocean. Follow me for a moment from the Arctic to the Pacific, down into the Mariana Trench. In 1960, the bathyscaphe Trieste carried Don Walsh and Jacques Piccard almost 11,000 meters down, inside a tiny steel sphere bolted beneath a floating gasoline-filled tank. Its walls so thick that only a cramped pocket of air remained. More recently, Victor Vescovo's limiting factor, another deep-diving craft, reached the same abyss in a pressure-resistant titanium sphere, again just large enough for a small crew and their instruments, suspended like a bead at the end of a very heavy string of systems. Now, picture what happens on those dives. These vehicles sink slowly, guided mostly by gravity and ballast, rather than by graceful underwater flight. They descend for hours, touch the deep sea floor, spend a short time photographing, sampling, listening to the silence, and then they drop weights and rise back toward the surface world. They are more like deep-sea elevators than ships, moving almost straight up and down through the water column, with very limited horizontal range and almost no agility compared to a true submarine. Military and research submarines live a different kind of life. They must travel thousands of kilometers, slip under ice and back into open water, change depth again and again as they chase sound channels or avoid obstacles, and keep dozens of people and complex systems alive for months at a time. Inside their hulls, there are sleeping spaces, food stores, batteries, reactors, sensors, torpedoes, laboratories. A whole small world sealed away from the ocean's pressure, not for a few hours, but for long, continuous stretches of years of operation. Because of that, the engineering choices almost invert. A bathyscaphe accepts slowness, tight quarters, and a tiny payload in exchange for maximum depth and a wide safety margin against crushing pressure. A submarine sacrifices ultimate depth for speed, endurance, and the ability to carry people, tools, and data back and forth beneath the ice and across the Earth's curved surface. Not a single compromise is the same. Here is the quiet pattern interrupt. We often picture reaching the bottom as the end of the story, as if touching the deepest mud means we have conquered the deep ocean. But touching is not the same as living there. We're going to keep returning to that idea. For now, it's enough to notice that our deepest craft dip briefly into that hidden world and then retreat, while our submarines roam only in the upper, more forgiving layers. So even though we can send small spheres down into trenches far deeper than the Arctic basins, we cannot yet build something that moves through those depths the way submarines move under thinner ice. We can visit the deepest places, in short, carefully planned descents. We cannot yet inhabit them, or wander freely beneath a shifting ceiling of ice, the way we do in the lighter, more familiar waters closer to the surface. The polar abyss. How deep is the Arctic really? So when we say we cannot yet inhabit the deepest water, we should also be clear about what that water actually looks like. The Arctic Ocean is not one smooth, uniform bowl of cold blue depth. It is a patchwork, a broken mosaic of very shallow and very deep places, stitched together by hidden ridges that never quite reach the surface. We often picture the North Pole as a single point on a map, a flag on a flat sheet of ice. But beneath that drifting ice, the seafloor steps down in great terraces. Around the edges, near Siberia, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. Broad continental shelves spread out like submerged plains, often only tens or a few hundreds of meters deep, with sand and mud and old river channels carved during colder years when sea level was lower. Then, suddenly, the ground falls away into central basins, thousands of meters deep, divided by underwater mountain chains such as the Lomonosov and Gakkel ridges. Follow me, just in your mind, from one of those shelves out into the middle. The light fades, the water grows darker, the pressure climbs, and we slide over the rim of one of these basins. Somewhere out here lies the Malloy Deep, the deepest known point in the Arctic. A narrow trench dropping to about 5,550 meters beneath the surface of the sea. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and imagine what that number means. A typical modern military submarine might have a test depth of 300 to 600 meters, a kind of agreed-upon safe limit, with a hidden margin beneath that which crews hope never to touch. The Malloy Deep is roughly 10 times deeper than a 300-meter test depth, and still about 9 times deeper than 600. If we took the Eiffel Tower and lowered it in, we could stack 5 of them, end to end, and still have room for another half tower before we reached the mud. Now, picture what happens if we try to place that familiar steel cylinder of a submarine into this space. The hull is engineered to live in a certain band of pressure, a narrow vertical strip of the ocean, far above the Malloy Deep. Long before we reached even half its depth, we would cross an invisible line where metal begins to whisper and groan in ways no captain wants to hear. Not because our machines are weak, but because this part of the Earth is simply that strong. And it is not just the Malloy. Many of the Arctic basins, like the Eurasian and Americian basins, reach 3, 4, even 5 kilometers down, forming vast dark bowls of water that no crewed submarine could linger in without courting extreme risk. Our under-ice patrols, our careful scientific cruises, all take place in the upper skin of these bowls, skimming along a few hundred meters down, while thousands of meters of unmoving cold wait silently below. In that sense, even when we say we are traveling under the Arctic ice, we are really only tracing the rim of a much larger hidden world. We navigate between the ice ceiling above and a pressure wall below, never truly entering the deepest rooms of this ocean. The question, of course, is what it would take to cross that lower boundary, and what new dangers would wake up as we tried. Where the gorges go silent. Defining the pressure zone. To answer that, we first have to give this lower boundary a name and a shape. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts. Because what we're going to define is not a sharp line on a chart, but a kind of invisible band in the water, a zone where the gauges may still move, yet their meaning for human safety begins to fade. We'll call it the pressure zone. Not a single depth, not a neat number written in a manual, but a range of depths where the combination of steel limits, ice ceilings, and mission needs slowly twist from difficult into untenable. We often picture a submarine as either safe or crushed, as if there were only two states. Yet in reality, there is this in-between region where every extra meter of depth adds more risk than it adds usefulness. Imagine the control room of a modern submarine under the Arctic, the hull already near its test depth, perhaps a few hundred meters beneath the surface. The pressure outside is dozens of times higher than the air in your lungs, and still rising by roughly 1 atmosphere every 10 meters. On paper, there may be a margin below that test depth, a secret buffer before the true failure point. But now, picture what happens as we edge closer. Wells that were comfortably overbuilt become merely adequate. Tiny flaws matter more, and the safety margin that once felt generous narrows to a thin, uneasy line. For most submarines, the pressure zone begins just below that official safe limit, in the grey band where the designer's confidence gives way to the crew's caution. It is not that the hull must fail there, but that the cost of a miscalculation, or a stuck control surface, or a misread chart becomes too high for any reasonable commander to accept. The gauges still work, yet they are no longer invitations, they are warnings. Under ice, this zone does something strange. It rises. Even at moderate depths, the impossibility of a quick ascent turns the water above the hull into a second kind of weight, because you cannot simply shoot upward and break through to air. Thick pressure ridges, stacked ice tens of meters deep, and moving flows mean that a depth that would be routine in open ocean becomes part of the pressure zone here, a place where rescue is slower, options are fewer, and the cold world above feels heavier. Beneath that band, below the last depth where a crewed vessel can operate with any sense of control, lies an almost separate ocean. It appears on maps, in sonar profiles, in careful models of temperature and salt, yet not in the lived memories of sailors. It is a hidden place that exists for us only as numbers and echoes. This is where, in a practical sense, the ocean begins to exist without us, where our machines, as we currently build them, simply do not belong. Follow me a little further, and we'll ask what it would take to send anything safely across that border, and what new kinds of silence might be waiting on the other side. Listening from above, how we sense the unreachable deep. So if the ocean beyond that border exists, for now, without our machines, how do we learn anything about it at all? How do we study a cold, pressurized world we can't safely enter? To begin to answer that, make yourself comfortable and slow your thoughts for a moment, because the tools we use are as quiet and patient as the ice itself. We often picture exploration as touch, as boots on a surface or a vehicle gliding through the deep. But under the Arctic, much of what we know comes from listening instead. Ships and submarines send out short pulses of sound, careful pings that spread through the water, slip under the ice, and fall down into the darkness until they strike the seafloor and return as faint, delayed echoes. From the time those echoes take to come back, we can sketch the depth. From how the sound is scattered, we can guess at mud, rock, or steep cliff. Now, picture what happens when we repeat that, not once, but thousands of times over many years. Slowly, a ghostly outline of the deep Arctic basins appears. Long trenches, broad plains, sudden underwater mountains that never see the light. We are not there, not really, yet through sound alone we begin to sense the shape of the hidden floor beneath the polar ocean. Above that water, the ice itself becomes another puzzle. From aircraft and from orbit, we send down radar, a kind of radio light that can pass through snow and bounce off layers of ice and water. Tiny changes in the returning signal reveal how thick the ice is, where it has been crushed into towering pressure ridges, and where it has been pulled apart into thin, fragile leads. Satellites watch even more gently, measuring the height of the ice surface to within a few centimeters, and from that small difference between ice and open water, They estimate thickness across almost the entire Arctic world. There is another, stranger sense as well. As a satellite glides around the Earth, its path is tugged ever so slightly by gravity. Where there is an underwater mountain, the extra mass pulls a little harder. Where there is a trench, the pull is weaker. By tracking those tiny changes in motion, we infer whole chains of submarine peaks and valleys that no human eye has seen, features that rise and fall beneath the ice and deep water like a drowned mountain range. All of these methods give us outlines and hints, shapes, depths, slopes, the rough architecture of a world beneath the ice. They can tell us where a glacier once carved the seafloor, where sediments have piled up for thousands of years, where the pressure of the overlying ocean might be greatest. But they cannot tell us what it feels like to move through those passages, to watch particles drift in the beam of a light, to hear the creak of distant ice overhead. So we live with a gap. We're going to keep drawing the map in broad strokes from far above, while knowing that we cannot yet send a crewed vessel to wander freely through the deepest under-ice labyrinths. Somewhere below, there are corridors no submarine can reach, chambers no robot has survived to see. In the next part, we'll follow that boundary more closely and ask what kind of ship, if any, could ever cross into that pressure-ruled place and come back to tell us what it found. Almost there, never there. Measurement versus presence. So we find ourselves standing at that invisible border, where our submarines must stop and the pressure-ruled world beneath the ice begins, and it raises a quiet but unsettling question. What does it really mean to say we have been somewhere? We often picture a place as conquered, the moment we can draw it on a map or label it with a depth. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and imagine the difference between looking at a high-resolution satellite image of Mars and standing on the Martian surface. In one case, we have exquisite detail: craters, canyons, dust storms frozen in light. In the other, we have presence: the crunch of regolith under a boot, the thin wind, the sky not as a photograph but as a ceiling you can look up at and feel. Both are knowledge, but only one is a life lived in that place. Now, picture what happens when we bring that analogy back down to our own planet, to the polar abyss beneath the North Pole. On paper, it seems familiar. We have depth profiles that trace the sea floor like a heartbeat, temperature curves that show where cold, dense water sinks, and where slightly warmer layers slide above, salinity measurements that tell us how much ice has melted into the sea over years and years. The numbers are real. The path is not. Because there is no continuous, lived track through the deepest under-ice waters, no liner pilot has flown again and again until they know each turn by feel. Instead, we lower instruments on cables, letting them fall through the dark, then winching them back before the ice can trap the line. Or we drop expendable probes that dive once, record pressure and temperature and salinity, and then vanish into the deep, their data relayed home while their small bodies are left to drift. These touches are brief, almost like pressing a fingertip against a window and then pulling it away. They do not replace a vehicle that can steer, pause, change its mind, and return at will. They do not give us the quiet, continuous experience of a submarine gliding under a glacier roof, a human hand on the controls, a human heartbeat matching the slow rise and fall of the hull. Follow me, just in your thoughts, into that emotional gap. There is the ocean as a set of numbers, a world flattened into graphs and tables, where each layer of water is a line and each change in pressure is a neat step on a screen. And then there is the ocean as a place, a cold surrounding presence, where a pilot can look out a small round window and feel the weight of the ice above and the miles of water beneath, not as data, but as something almost like a mind pressing back. We're going to, someday, try to cross that gap under the polar ice as we once tried to cross it on Mars. Until then, we are almost there, but never there. So imagine, just before we move on, what it would feel like to be the first human truly present in those deepest hidden corridors. To switch off the lights, let your eyes adjust, and realize that no one, in all of Earth's long history, has ever seen this exact patch of water before. What kind of vessel would you trust in that moment? And what would it have to survive just to bring you home again? When the ocean fights back, engineering as a quiet struggle. In that imagined darkness, with the lights of our vessel dimmed and the water pressing in from every side, we meet a quiet truth. This is one of the hardest engineering problems on Earth. Not just deep water, not just ice, not just cold, but all of them at once layered together into a world beneath the surface that barely tolerates our presence at all. We often picture a submarine as a kind of underwater spaceship, gliding calmly through the deep, its hull a simple metal shell holding back the sea. But down here, under Arctic ice and ancient glacier fragments, that shell is more like a contested boundary, a thin curved wall separating human air from an ocean that is trying very patiently to come in. Every 10 meters, the pressure climbs, another invisible weight added, until hundreds of atmospheres are resting on every square meter of steel or titanium. Now, picture what happens when we add the ceiling. Above us is not open water, but a lid of ice that may be tens of meters thick in places, bristling with pressure ridges and frozen rubble. It is not a clean, flat roof we can simply poke through when we are ready to go home. The ice itself flows, creeps, and warps over months and years, behaving less like a rigid slab and more like an astonishingly slow, viscous fluid that can sag into gaps and squeeze shut any narrow opening we manage to cut. For the vehicles we send into this cold place, that means surfacing is no longer guaranteed. A small lead in the ice can close, a thin patch can drift away. A hole laboriously melted can be pinched from the sides as the glacier above redistributes its own immense weight. A submarine that rises into the wrong pocket can find itself trapped, pressed gently but firmly between water below and ice above, with nowhere to go but back into the deep. And the hull is never just holding still. Even in calm water, it flexes under dynamic loads as we turn, rise, and sink, as currents push unevenly along its length, as it brushes, however lightly, against ice keels hanging down or the soft sediments of the seafloor. The structure that looks so solid in a diagram becomes, in practice, a breathing, straining shell, constantly negotiating tiny deformations before they grow into cracks. Every place we pierce that shell becomes a question mark, a hatch for people, a window for cameras, a port for a sensor, a cable, a manipulator arm. Each one interrupts the smooth curve that spreads pressure safely. At those edges and corners, forces concentrate, like light through a lens, and the ocean patiently searches for the smallest weakness, the tiniest shortcut, through our careful design. So when we say this is an extreme engineering challenge, we are not only talking about stronger metals or thicker walls. We are talking about designing a whole moving habitat that must survive not just static pressure, but the restless push and pull of a living ocean, the slow squeeze of shifting ice, and the uncertain terrain beneath. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts, and you can almost feel how the environment begins to resemble an opponent, not intelligent in the way we are, but relentlessly effective at exploiting every compromise, every rushed decision, every place where we hoped the forces would be just a little kinder than they really are. Follow me a little further, because to understand how close we are to that breaking point, we're going to look at the invisible border where our strongest hulls simply refuse to go, and where the ocean, at last, wins by default. Rhythms in the dark, returning to the hidden world. So here, at that invisible border where the ocean wins by default, let's slow down again and look around in the dark for a moment. Not with instruments or diagrams, but with the quiet picture we've been building together. Follow me back to that central image we've been circling. A dark, cold world beneath the Arctic ice, stretching out in every direction under a ceiling of frozen white, while a thin band of human presence drifts somewhere above. Metal hulls and fragile signals suspended over an untouched abyss. We are up there, in that narrow layer, And almost everything we care about is happening far below it, out of reach. We often picture the polar ocean as just more water, just deeper blue under thicker ice. But the farther down we go in our minds, the more it stops feeling like part of our familiar Earth and starts to feel like an alien planet with its own rules, its own invisible atmosphere of pressure, its own landscapes no human eye has ever seen directly. Ridges of rock drowned in blackness, slopes dusted with fine sediments, slow falls of ice crystals drifting like snow in a night that has lasted for millions of years. Make yourself comfortable where you are right now, on your bed or your sofa, or wherever this finds you, and notice the tiny local world around you, the softness of fabric under your hands, the still air touching your face, the very gentle weight of the room pressing in from all sides. Now, picture what happens if we replace the walls with water, not a swimming pool, not even the open sea you might have floated in, but kilometers of cold, heavy water stacked above you, each 10 meters adding another atmosphere of pressure, another invisible hand pushing down. As you take your next breath, notice how easily your chest rises. No effort, no resistance. Then imagine trying to do that under hundreds of atmospheres of pressure, where even steel begins to feel like wax. The contrast is almost absurd, and yet this is the same planet, the same globe of rock and water and ice, turning quietly in space. It can be tempting to treat those depths as a challenge we simply haven't solved yet, another engineering puzzle we will eventually conquer if we just build thicker hulls and smarter machines. But this is not a story of failure. It is a story of limits, of places where the combination of ice and pressure and darkness pushes back hard enough that our tools must stop, not because we are weak, but because the deep ocean is allowed to keep some of itself. There is something strangely beautiful in that resistance. Some parts of our own world remain hidden, not out of neglect, but because they are structured in a way that does not easily welcome us in. Under the North Pole, beneath the shifting ice and the narrow tracks of our submarines, most of the water column is still a private, silent realm. So for now, we're going to let it stay that way, at least in our minds. Let yourself slow your thoughts, and let the repeated images return. Ice above, darkness below, a thin human layer in between. If you find your attention drifting, that's all right. Just come back to the feeling of breathing in a light room while far away, the heavy ocean breathes in its own slow rhythm. Here in the middle of the story, we don't need to solve anything. We're simply acknowledging that there are places on Earth that remain, in a very real sense, inaccessible. And yet, that inaccessibility is not a closed door, but an invitation to wonder. Because when we accept that we cannot go everywhere, we begin to ask a quieter question: what is this hidden world doing right now in the dark, without us? In a moment, we'll follow that question a little deeper and see how these unreachable depths still shape the surface we live on. Cold steel, colder water, the extra hazards of polar operations. So when we ask what this hidden world is doing without us, we also have to ask what happens to the few machines we dare to send into it, especially when they slip under the ice in the far north, where the water is not just dark, but brutally cold. Follow me for a moment into that colder layer, where even steel begins to feel the strain. We often picture a submarine as a kind of invulnerable metal whale, a smooth shape of cold steel gliding calmly beneath the surface. But in polar waters, that image quietly comes apart. Metals that are tough and forgiving in milder seas can turn brittle as the temperature falls, their crystal structures tightening, tiny flaws becoming the starting point for cracks. Seals stiffen, rubber hardens, and lubricants thicken until gears and valves that were meant to move like a slow breath begin to jerk and hesitate instead. Inside, the crew tries to keep a small pocket of warmth alive, a human world of shirt sleeves and instruments and coffee, while just beyond the hull the Arctic Ocean patiently drains that heat away. The surrounding water acts like an endless hungry radiator, carrying off every stray watt of warmth the systems produce. So heaters must run, and pipes must be coddled, because if they cool too far, screens dim, batteries lose strength, and delicate components drift out of the temperatures they were designed to survive in. Now, picture what happens closer to the surface, where the submarine has to talk to the air above or trade water with the sea to rise and sink. Any exposed fitting, any mast or sensor that breaks through a thin lead in the ice can be kissed instantly by freezing spray that hardens into ice. Valves in ballast systems that pull in seawater can gather frail films of ice inside, films that thicken, seize, and suddenly refuse to move at the exact moment the ship needs to change depth quickly. Navigation, which already feels like guessing in the dark, becomes even more uncertain this far north. Magnetic compasses grow confused as we approach the pole, their needles tugged sideways by local anomalies in the Earth's field, and the usual corrections no longer behave in simple ways. GPS and other satellite signals, which we lean on so casually on the open ocean, are faint or unreachable when thick ice sits between antenna and sky. Under ice, a submarine must rely on inertial systems and careful dead reckoning, knowing that every tiny error accumulates over hours into kilometers of doubt. All of this happens while the pressure outside still climbs relentlessly with depth, while the ice ceiling above may be too thick to break in an emergency, and while the cold keeps quietly eroding the safety margins built into every bolt and bearing. Each extra hazard narrows the gap between normal operation and catastrophe until pushing toward a theoretical depth limit under polar ice stops feeling like exploration and starts to feel like tempting the ocean itself. And yet, as we'll see next, the ocean has one more way of tightening that grip. Stories from the ceiling, under ice submarine exercises. And yet, as we follow that tightening grip, we discover something almost paradoxical. Some of the most delicate, most stressful submarine work under the Arctic happens not at record-breaking depths, but in what should be the easy zone. The place where the hull is comfortable, where the pressure gauges are calm, and where the real danger hangs above, not below. Make yourself comfortable for a moment, and imagine we're inside a US Navy boat, or a Russian one easing its way under the polar cap. For decades, both navies have sent submarines on under-ice patrols, and every few years, the Americans stage ICEX, a kind of temporary village on the frozen surface where crews practice one very simple, very hard maneuver, bringing a steel cylinder from the dark world beneath up through a solid ceiling of ice. We often picture submarines as creatures of depth, slipping down into the cold to escape. Under the Arctic, they are creatures of distance instead, measuring, waiting, listening. Above the sail, the ice is not flat. It's a broken, drifting mosaic with thin sheets, thick slabs, and jagged pressure ridges, where the flows have collided and piled up into underwater walls. Some ridges can stack ice 10 or more meters thick, turning any thought of an emergency rise into a quiet, absolute no. So the crews turn their attention upward. Using special sonar that looks toward the surface, they sweep a cone of sound into the ice, tracing its underside the way fingers might trace the inside of a cave. They search for leads, those narrow lanes of open water, or for patches of thinner ice, just strong enough to hold together, just weak enough for a submarine to break through without tearing its own skin. Now, picture what happens as the boat creeps along at walking speed, stopping, backing, edging sideways, drawing a map of a ceiling it cannot see. In the official stories, this sounds routine. In the whispered versions, it is anything but. There are accounts of captains who misjudged and rose into ice that was thicker than expected, hearing the hull shudder and groan, as if the ocean itself were clearing its throat. Boats have found themselves temporarily wedged, not by the pressure of depth, but by a stubborn lid of frozen sea, forced to sink back down and spend long, anxious hours searching for another opening. All of this, and they are usually only a few hundred meters below the surface, well within the safe envelope the engineers designed, far from the theoretical crush depths we worry about. The steel is fine. The systems are fine. It is the geometry of ice and ocean that makes everything feel fragile. If such careful, almost surgical movements are required just to touch daylight through a few meters of ice, what would it mean to add several kilometers of abyss below, where rescue is impossible and the pressure turns from background to fate? Follow me in the next part as we let the seafloor fall away and see how quickly that thought experiment becomes a hard limit. The Titan lesson. When pressure wins quickly, so when we let that seafloor fall away, we don't have to imagine an abstract danger. We already have a very real story of what happens when pressure stops being a number on a gauge and becomes the only thing that matters. In 2002-03, the small tourist submersible Titan vanished near the wreck of the Titanic, and within days investigators concluded that it had suffered a catastrophic failure of its hull at depth. No drama, no long struggle. Just pressure, meeting material limits, and winning. Make yourself comfortable for a moment with what that actually means. Titan was not at the deepest point of the ocean, not even close. It was operating in the realm of a few thousand meters. A cold, silent place where the pressure is hundreds of times greater than at the surface, but still shallower than the Great Trenches, and even shallower than some of the polar basins we're talking about tonight. We often picture those depths as impossibly remote, but in the scale of the abyss, Titan was only partway down the staircase. The people behind it were not careless thrill seekers. They were trying to innovate, to open up a hidden world to more eyes. Yet the craft itself relied on experimental choices, like a carbon fiber main hull instead of the thick steel or titanium shells that traditional deep-sea engineering prefers, not because those old materials are exciting, but because they fail slowly, predictably, with large safety margins built in. Not sleekness, but conservatism. Now picture what happens when we relax those margins in a place that does not forgive. At a few thousand meters, every square centimeter of the hull is carrying a load like a small car. A tiny flaw in the material, a layer that has been stressed one time too many, a calculation that assumes should be fine instead of must be safe, can turn the entire structure from protection into hazard. There is no warning siren that buys you 5 minutes. There is no rescue ship that can dive down in time. When the hull loses its argument with the ocean, the conversation is over in an instant. Here is the pattern interrupt the sea offers us. Titan's depth, impressive as it was, still lies above parts of the Arctic and Antarctic seafloor. Above under-ice trenches, where the pressure grows even higher and the ceiling is not open water but thick, shifting ice. If we're going to dream about sending crewed vehicles into those deep, locked-in spaces beneath the polar ice, we have to slow our thoughts and remember that lesson. The ocean does not negotiate, and under a glacier, there isn't even the option of an emergency ascent. Any future craft that dares to go there will need margins not just a little better than Titan's, but far more cautious than anything we routinely accept today. Because somewhere further down, under more ice and more years of accumulated cold, is a world that will only ever meet us on its own terms. Antarctica's shadow, learning from Lake Vostok and beyond. So to feel what that really means, make yourself comfortable for a moment and follow me far from the Arctic to another cold, hidden world that we've managed to touch only with great difficulty. We're going to stand, in our minds, on the high, wind-scoured plateau of East Antarctica, where the air is thin and bitter, and the ice under our boots is not just meters thick, but kilometers deep. Beneath that frozen surface lies Lake Vostok, a vast body of liquid water sealed under almost 4 kilometers of ice, held in darkness and high pressure for hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years. We often picture lakes as open, sunlit places with waves and birds and reeds at the edge. But this one is more like a buried ocean, roofed by ice, its shoreline pressed tight against rock that no human eye has ever seen. It is part Earth, part alien planet, quietly waiting in the deep. For decades, scientists dreamed of reaching it, not with a careless hole, but with a passage so clean that the modern world would not spill into that ancient water. Not because we fear the lake, but because a single trace of surface life, a few cells from our own skin, could overwhelm any fragile ecosystem that has evolved down there in isolation. So every step had to be deliberate, every substance controlled, every tool sterilized. Again and again, they drilled through the glacier with a column of special fluid that balanced the pressure and stopped the ice from closing, and they had to make sure that fluid never truly met the lake itself. They paused for years to redesign equipment, argued over contamination standards, and waited for better methods, while the boreholes slowly refroze and the Antarctic winter erased tracks on the surface. Progress was measured not in days, but in seasons and in years. It was, in many ways, the opposite of a dramatic expedition. It was patience, distilled. And remember, in this Antarctic story, the main enemies are thickness and sterility, not the crushing weight of a deep ocean. The ice is heavy, the pressure is high, but there is no extra 5,000 meters of water sitting underneath, no shifting sea ice ceiling, no need for a submarine to survive and navigate in the dark below. Even so, Lake Vostok has demanded generations of quiet persistence. Now, picture what happens when we take that same idea and slide it under the Arctic basins, where the ice is only the first barrier, and the real descent begins after the glacier ends. If it takes this much effort just to sip from a hidden lake on land, how much more intricate and fragile would a mission be that must also endure the full pressure of the deep polar ocean? Our experience in Antarctica shows us both how ingenious we can be and how stubborn ice-covered water worlds truly are, on this Earth and on others. And the next challenge waits where these two difficulties finally meet. Europa in our backyard, astrobiology and the polar abyss. Where those two difficulties meet on Earth, something else quietly appears in the background. It looks less like engineering and more like science fiction slowly becoming real. Because when we talk about ice-covered oceans that we can barely touch, we're no longer just talking about Greenland or Antarctica or the basins hidden beneath the Arctic. We're also, without quite saying it, talking about Europa and Enceladus. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and imagine this: a cold moon far from our sun, its surface a cracked, gleaming shell of ice, streaked with dark lines and scattered impact scars. Beneath that shell, not a little pond, not a narrow channel, but an entire global ocean, deep and black and sealed away for billions of years. That's what many scientists think lies under Europa's ice, and under Enceladus, where plumes of water jet into space like slow, frozen geysers. We often picture alien oceans as wild fantasy, yet when researchers plan missions to these distant worlds, they turn first to our own polar regions. They look at Lake Vostok under Antarctica's ice, at subglacial lakes in Greenland, at the deep cavities beneath Arctic shelves, and they say, this is the closest we have. These are the places on Earth where sunlight never reaches, where liquid water is locked beneath ice, where life, if it exists, must endure in darkness and under relentless pressure. Follow me now from those far-off moons back to the high Arctic. Somewhere beneath the drifting pack, in the deepest under-ice basins, the ocean thickens into a cold, heavy stillness that no diver will ever feel directly. We cannot map every fold of the seabed, we cannot watch the slow circulation in person, and we can barely keep delicate instruments alive there for long. Yet, on a smaller, humbler scale, these hidden basins may be the closest analog we have to Europa's unreachable sea, or to the abyss beneath Enceladus's crust. Now, picture what happens when we try to reach them. To send a vehicle down from the surface, through moving ice, into a deep polar basin is already a kind of controlled impossibility. The ice shifts, the water is dark, the pressure grows with every meter, and communication becomes faint and slow. If we struggle to guide a robot a few kilometers down under our own glaciers, what does that say about melting a tunnel through tens of kilometers of alien ice on a world with no rescue, no quick return, and no second chances? It's not just a technical question, but a temporal one. If we are still learning how to touch the oceans beneath our own polar ice without breaking them, how many years or centuries will it be before we can truly explore the oceans of other worlds? Swarms in the dark. Could tiny robots go where subs can't? So if even our most ambitious cryobots and drills struggle just to touch these buried seas, what else could we send into that cold, high-pressure world beneath the ice? Follow me into a slightly different kind of speculation, where exploration doesn't look like a single brave vessel, but a cloud of tiny, patient machines. We often picture a submarine as a sleek, elongated shape, full of people, screens, and air pushing through the dark. Now, picture what happens if we shrink that idea down until each explorer is no bigger than a suitcase, or even a shoebox, with no room for a human body at all, only sensors, batteries, and a thick shell built purely to survive pressure. The smaller they become, the more their walls can be relatively thicker, the more their shapes can be simple spheres or rounded capsules that spread the crushing force evenly. In that sense, size becomes a kind of shield. A crude submarine must devote most of its volume to keeping us alive, to holding a warm, breathable pocket of Earth's surface conditions inside a hostile deep ocean. A swarm of uncrewed drones, by contrast, can give almost every cubic centimeter to structure, insulation, and simple rugged mechanisms. No windows, no life support, no emergency escape routes, just a hard, quiet shell facing the weight of thousands of meters of water and ice. Imagine a larger mothership, submarine, staying up in the safer layers of the Arctic Ocean, or an ice-piercing platform slowly melted down from above, arriving at a single opening into the deep basins. From that one fragile doorway, hundreds of these small drones could drift out and fan through the darkness, some hugging the sea floor, some rising toward the underside of the ice, mapping, measuring temperature and salinity, tasting faint chemical traces of life. Over years, their combined tracks could turn an unknown abyss into a detailed three-dimensional portrait. Then the pattern breaks. How do you talk to a suitcase-sized robot 5 kilometers down, with kilometers of ice overhead? Radio waves fade. Light is swallowed. Sound travels but slowly, and with echoes off the rough hidden ceiling of the glacier and the uneven seafloor. Each drone would need to think for itself, to make decisions in the dark, because instructions from the surface might arrive late, or not at all. Power becomes another quiet enemy. Batteries drain in the cold. Tiny nuclear sources raise ethical questions. Tethers risk snagging on ridges and sediments. Some drones might never return, their data locked away forever in a place no one will visit, their small hulls slowly buried by mud or encased in refreezing ice. So we're going to imagine these swarms not as conquering fleets, but as offerings we send into a world that mostly keeps what it takes. They might, one day, let us map the pressure zone more fully than any single submarine could. Yet even then, it would still be our instruments that enter, not our bodies. Measurement, not presence. Numbers and images, not breath and heartbeat. And that raises a deeper question. If we can fill these hidden basins with data, but never with ourselves, have we truly been there, or only brushed the edge of another unreachable place? Melt drills and ice tunnels, rethinking access from above, so if numbers and images are all that can safely cross the pressure zone, we might ask, could we at least open a doorway from above, a narrow throat through the ice, and lower our curiosity straight down into that hidden world? For a moment, make yourself comfortable with that idea, and slow your thoughts, because the reality of such a doorway is much stranger and much more fragile than it first appears. We often picture drilling as a violent act, steel teeth chewing their way downward, but under the great ice sheets, the gentler tools are the ones that work best. Hot water drills spray carefully heated water that melts the ice as they descend, carving a temporary shaft through hundreds, even thousands of meters. Thermal probes, slow metal cylinders with warm skins, can do the same, sinking over days or weeks until they reach the dark water beneath. They do not cut the glacier, they persuade it to move aside. Now, picture what happens when that shaft finally breaks through. Above is a cold, airless tunnel in the ice, walls already thinking about refreezing. Below is the ocean, pressurized and restless, pressing upward into the new opening. Between them hangs whatever we dare to send, perhaps a slender, deep-diving vehicle waiting to slip free and descend. We're going to imagine lowering a miniature submarine, a robot built for thousands of meters of water, through that vertical melt drill, bypassing the dangerous search for a thin spot in the ice to surface laterally. On paper, it sounds almost elegant. In practice, the ice refuses to cooperate. The shaft begins to close as soon as the hot water stops flowing, freezing from the walls inward, from the top downward, from the bottom upward. Keeping it open means constantly circulating warm water, pumping energy down and waste heat back up. For hours or days, the interface where ice becomes liquid and liquid becomes deep ocean is unstable. Pressure changes can drive sudden flows, slush can jam instruments, and delicate cables can freeze into the walls if we pause too long. And then we add depth, not a few hundred meters of water, but several thousand. The vehicle lowered through this narrow throat cannot be just an under-ice explorer, sensing ceilings and navigating in total darkness. It must also be a full deep diver, with a hull that tolerates hundreds of atmospheres of pressure, motors that still turn in the coldest brine, batteries that survive a journey measured not in minutes, but in long, silent hours. Every kilogram we add for deep ocean survival makes it harder to thread that slim column of water in the ice, because somewhere far below that shaft's fragile opening, the polar basins fall away into trenches like the Malloy Deep, more than 5.5 kilometers beneath the surface, where even our bravest machines hesitate. Melt drills and ice tunnels may one day let us touch the upper shelves of this abyss, tasting the edges of a realm we cannot see, but the full depth will likely remain out of reach for a long time. And even if we solve the ice above and the pressure below, there is still one more boundary waiting for us, one that moves and fractures and sometimes disappears entirely. Material limits. Is there a hard stop for human hulls? That moving boundary in the ice has a twin, far below it, in the water itself. Make yourself comfortable for a moment and slow your thoughts, because we're going to step, very gently, into the question that quietly haunts every deep-diving engineer. Is there a depth at which the ocean doesn't just resist us, but refuses us entirely? We often picture a submarine as a kind of underwater aircraft, a sleek metal shape that can simply be made stronger and sent deeper, as if the only limit were our courage or our budget. But now, picture what happens as we push that hull down, 10 meters, 100, 1,000, each step adding another layer of pressure, another invisible hand squeezing in from every direction. To survive, the hull has only a few options. It can grow thicker, it can shrink smaller, or it can be built from something radically different from the metals we've trusted for years. Thickening seems simple, almost comforting. Just add more steel, more titanium, more structure. Yet every extra centimeter of metal eats into the space inside, stealing room from the very people and systems the vessel is meant to protect. A hull twice as thick does not just weigh more. It leaves a much smaller pocket of air within, a tighter, more constrained world where there is less room for crew, for life support, for the instruments that would study the cold darkness beneath the glacier. Imagine trying to live for weeks in a pressure sphere only a few meters wide, walls massively thick, Interior barely large enough to stretch your legs. That is where the math quietly leads us. At some depth, a full-sized under-ice submarine, with long corridors and workspaces and storage, becomes almost impossible without turning into a solid lump of metal with a tiny bubble trapped inside. The ocean, in a sense, wins by geometry alone. So we look to other materials, advanced ceramics that shrug off compression but crack if they're flawed, composite shells that layer fibers and resins into strong, light skins but are hard to inspect for tiny weaknesses, graded structures that change composition from outer surface to inner core, trying to spread the pressure smoothly instead of letting it bite in one sharp step. On paper, they promise miracles. In practice, scaling them up into large, reliable hulls that can endure years of fatigue, ice impacts, and the unknowns of a shifting under-ice world is a challenge we have not yet met. Because somewhere below the last tested depth, there may be a line we cannot cross with anything roomy or familiar. Beyond it, perhaps only very small, crude spheres will ever be possible, brief human visitors in tiny bubbles of air, or more likely, no people at all. Only unmanned probes and robot swarms feeling their way through the dark. The pressure zone under the polar ice might not just be a temporary engineering problem, waiting patiently for the right alloy or clever design. It might be a permanent boundary for human-occupied vehicles, a reminder that some parts of Earth, like some parts of distant icy moons, may only ever be touched by machines. And as we ask what that means for exploration, another limit comes into view, not made of metal or ice at all, but of power, how we feed these distant, patient robots in a place where sunlight never reaches. Ethics at the edge. Should we push into every depth? But before we rush to send those distant, patient robots into every last black corner, we have to pause and ask a quieter question. Should we? We're going to stand, just for a moment, at that edge where engineering meets ethics, where the cold arithmetic of pressure and power touches something softer in us. We often picture exploration as an uncomplicated good, a kind of map slowly filling in until no blank spaces remain. From the first sea charts to satellites tracing every coastline, we've spent years trying to turn the whole surface of the Earth into something known. Now, picture what happens when that impulse looks down through the ice into the deep basins hidden beneath Arctic glaciers and polar seas. The same desire wakes up, to send a machine there, to measure, to film, to claim that we have finally seen. But beneath that ice is a world that has never been lit by the sun, a place that has evolved in darkness and silence, shaped by pressure and cold over immense stretches of time. Imagine a tiny community of microbes on a rocky ledge, or pale, slow-moving animals in a valley no light has ever reached. For them, the hum of a thruster, the beam of a lamp, or a trace of chemical contamination is not just a curiosity. It is a shock. It is a new force suddenly arriving in a world that did not ask for visitors. Because here, disturbance doesn't fade quickly. At extreme depth, where currents are sluggish and sediments settle like dust in a sealed room, anything we drop is likely to stay. A lost probe, a leaking battery, a torn piece of insulation can sink into a trench or under-ice basin and remain there for geological timescales, folded into the deep story of the planet long after our own civilizations have vanished. Not dramatically, just permanently. This is the pattern interrupt in our usual story of discovery. We are used to thinking that if we can reach a place we ought to, that not going is a kind of failure. But what if some inaccessibility is a kind of protection? When a roof of ice and a wall of pressure make it nearly impossible for us to arrive, they are also making it nearly impossible for us to interfere, to overuse, or to turn a hidden world into a resource. So make yourself comfortable with the discomfort of not knowing everything. Slow your thoughts for a moment and follow me through this possibility, that leaving a few deep, cold pockets untouched might be one of the most respectful choices we can make as a species. The pressure zone, then, is not just a technical boundary that our hulls and batteries struggle to cross. It is an invitation to decide how far we truly want our machines to reach and what kind of relationship we want with the last places on Earth that still do not know we exist. The ocean's right to remain unseen, so when we say that leaving a few deep, cold pockets untouched might be an act of respect, we're also admitting something quieter and a little humbling. This planet does not owe us access. Beneath the ice, in that narrow pressure zone where our machines hesitate and our maps go pale, the ocean continues on as if we had never learned its name. We often picture the deep as an empty backdrop, waiting patiently for us to arrive with lights and cameras and careful notes. But if you slow your thoughts for a moment and make yourself comfortable with not knowing, you can almost feel that it has its own slow calendar, its own unhurried rhythms, ticking away in darkness, indifferent to whether we ever visit it directly. It is not hostile, exactly, just busy being itself. Follow me in imagination for a moment. Under the Arctic ice, where the ceiling is frozen and shifting and the floor drops away into basins like the Malloy Deep, the water is moving even when nothing else seems to. Tiny density differences, faint temperature gradients, and the steady pull of Earth's rotation set up currents we will never name, turning over water that has been cold for hundreds of years. Particles drift down from the surface, flake by flake, like a slow, silent snow that never melts. Every age of exploration has run into places like this. There were once edges of the world, drawn at the Pillars of Hercules, then at the Antarctic Circle, then at the first thin blue line of space. Some of those frontiers yielded when ships grew stronger, or rockets more reliable. Others never really moved. They just changed shape and slipped a little further away from our reach. The pressure zone under the polar ice may be one of those remaining edges, one of the last places where the Earth simply says no, or at least not yet. Not because we lack imagination, but because the combination of ice above, rock below, and crushing pressure in between is a kind of quiet boundary, a reminder that this world does not have to be fully open to feel fully real. There is a certain comfort in that thought, if we let it in. Not everything has to be observed, measured, and controlled for it to matter. A hidden valley beneath a glacier, a dark pocket of water that has never seen the surface, a community of possible lives feeding on chemical traces alone. All of these can be beautiful, even if we never lower a camera through the ice to see them. Now, picture what happens in that darkness while we sleep. Unseen currents slide along the seafloor. Pale creatures drift or crawl or simply wait. Minerals dissolve and reform under pressure, and the slow rain of particles continues, year after year, whether or not a submarine ever passes above. We're going to ask, in the next part, what it would really take to send something into that realm and bring it back again, and what we might risk disturbing if we finally succeed. You, floating above the boundary. So now, for a moment, make yourself comfortable again and let the images we've been building settle back into place like slow-falling snow in a dark, quiet room beneath the ice. We've talked about machines and limits and what it might take to go deeper, but before we follow the hardware, we're going to return to something simpler. You, a single point of awareness in the water. Imagine you are hanging there, weightless, in a cold, utterly still column of ocean under the Arctic. Above you, far above, the underside of the sea ice is only a suggestion, a faint paler ceiling where what little light remains is scattered and bruised by pressure ridges and old, refrozen leads. You cannot see the glacier or the surface of the Earth directly, but you can feel that there is structure up there, a hard, shifting roof to this hidden world. Now, picture what happens when you look down. Below you is not just darkness, but a different kind of darkness, one that feels heavier, more absolute, as if the very idea of down has thickened. The water is the same salt water, molecule for molecule, yet the weight of all that water, all those years of snowfall compacted into ice above, has turned the deep into something that feels almost solid with pressure. We often picture the ocean as one continuous place, a single connected volume stretching from the surface to the seafloor. But engineers and submariners know there is a line here, even if they never see it. Above your invisible feet, our submarines can exist. Their steel or titanium hulls, carefully curved and calculated, can hold back tens, even hundreds of atmospheres of pressure. Below that line, they cannot, at least not yet. At some depth, the gauges would redline, the margins would vanish, and the hull would fail. So you are floating right at that edge, at the boundary where our presence simply stops. Not by law or treaty, not because anyone decided to draw a border on a map, but because the physics of water and gravity and ice have drawn one for us. It is a strange feeling, isn't it, to realize that in the same cold, continuous ocean, there is a place where our technology just ends, and the world goes on without us. As you listen, you are, in a way, sharing that vantage point, suspended between the known and the unknowable parts of the ocean, between the bright, navigated layers where submarines practice under the ice, and the deeper, silent spaces where no hull has ever passed. In the next part, we'll ask what it would mean to build something that could cross that line, and whether we should. Slow recap, tracing our descent and our limits. So before we try to cross that line, let's slow our thoughts for a moment and look back at the path we've taken together. Make yourself comfortable and follow me, not deeper this time, but gently upward in your mind, retracing the layers of this cold, hidden world, from the bottom toward the surface. We began up there, where we often picture the Arctic as a flat white plate, a calm sheet of ice floating on a quiet sea, not chaos, but stillness. And then we peeled that illusion away. We saw that the surface is cracked and ridged, that pressure ridges stack ice into walls many meters high, and that beneath those frozen ceilings lies a narrow band of water where submarines can move, but only if they are careful, only if they always remember that the roof above them is alive. From there, we followed a submarine down, past the first few tens of meters where the light still remembers how to reach, into the dim blue where the hull begins to feel the weight of the ocean. Now picture what happens as we descend. Every 10 meters, another atmosphere of pressure, another invisible hand tightening around the steel. At 300, 400, 600 meters, we brushed against the typical limits of military submarines, those carefully tested depths beyond which the numbers on the gauge stop being reassuring and start becoming a warning. We talked about how those hulls are built to push back, how layers of metal and careful curves resist the squeeze of the deep, but only up to a point. Under free water, that point is already unforgiving. Under ice, it is sharper still, because here, a submarine cannot simply escape upward if something goes wrong. Thick ice, tilted slabs, and those same pressure ridges that sculpt the surface can trap a vessel beneath a ceiling it cannot break, turning even moderate depths into a place where every decision must be exact. Out of that tension came the idea of the pressure zone, this quiet conceptual boundary, where for us, the ocean effectively ends. Not because the water stops, but because our practical submarines, our patrols and under-ice exercises simply refuse to go deeper. Below that, the Arctic basin continues for thousands more meters, down toward trenches like the Malloy Deep, but for the kinds of craft we send under ice, it might as well be another planet. To glimpse that further world, we've had to change our tools. We remembered the tiny deep-diving spheres, the bathyscapies, and titanium-hulled research subs that creep rather than cruise, and the remote vehicles that dangle on cables or roam alone in the dark. We thought of Titan, a reminder of how unforgiving pressure can be, and of Lake Vostok, sealed under nearly 4 kilometers of Antarctic ice for millions of years, where sterilized drills and careful sensors try to touch water that has never known our presence. Around them hover ideas of cryobots, of swarms of robots, of future machines that might one day slip through ice and withstand pressures far beyond what today's submarines can bear. Seen together, this is not a tale of failure, but of coexistence with limits. The ice, the ocean, the buried lakes beneath glaciers, they mark out places on Earth that remain beyond our reach, at least for now. And in accepting that, we leave room for wonder. In the next part, we're going to ask what happens when we try, very carefully, to move that boundary, and what we risk losing if we ever succeed. If we could go deeper, imagining the first under-ice abyss voyage. So, after all those limits and quiet failures, make yourself comfortable for a different kind of journey. If we accept that the present cannot go there, we can still let a future version of us try. We're going to step far ahead in time, to a cold, patient Earth where our tools have finally caught up with our questions. Follow me to a small circle of light on the Arctic surface, cut cleanly through meters of sea ice and snow. Around it stands a lattice of towers and cables, humming softly in the polar night. This is not a launch pad in the usual sense, not rockets and flame, but a shaft melted straight down through ice and then water, a narrow throat connecting the air we breathe to the deep world beneath. Now, picture what happens at the bottom of that shaft. Suspended in the blackness is a vehicle that we often picture only in science fiction, part submarine, part bathyscape, part wandering observatory. Its heart is a thick, spherical crew module, a pressure shell nested inside other shells, built to withstand thousands of meters of water and the extra weight of the ice above, the kind of pressure that would turn a normal hull into shrapnel in a heartbeat. Outside that sphere, delicate and strong at the same time, are long-jointed robotic arms, hands for a place where no human arm can move. Around them, like a small constellation, drift swarms of drones, each no larger than a backpack, each carrying lights, cameras, and tiny samplers, fanning out into the abyss the way bats fan out from a cave at dusk. Together they make a kind of distributed submarine, a flock instead of a single body. Imagine sitting at one of the few small windows, or watching a wall of slow, high-resolution cameras. The seafloor of a deep polar basin comes into view, far below the usual routes of military subs, in a trench like the Malloy Deep, but even more remote beneath the ice. Sediments lie in fine, undisturbed layers, grains of dust that have been settling for thousands, maybe millions of years. There are no footprints, no tracks, only the soft scars of past landslides and the faint threads of burrows. In that cold, hidden place, strange life moves with almost unbearable slowness. Pale worms coil and uncoil in the mud. Transparent shrimp drift past like ghosts. On a rocky outcrop, a mat of microbes glows faintly in the lights, feeding not on sunlight but on chemical energy leaking from the crust. Is this what we might find under glaciers on Europa or Enceladus one day? To reach this moment, imagine how many layers of effort had to line up. Generations of engineers refining alloys and composites that do not crack at low temperature. Navigation that works without GPS. Power systems that can run for years without a cable to the surface. Treaties negotiated and renegotiated so that nations agree whose sensors go where, who owns the data, who is responsible if something breaks and cannot be retrieved from the deep. There would be long ethical arguments as well, echoing the debates around subglacial lakes and other fragile worlds. How do we sterilize a vehicle this complex well enough that we do not seed an untouched basin with surface bacteria? What if we discover a unique ecosystem and our very presence begins to change it? Not because we are careless, but because the boundary between observer and participant collapses under pressure. Whether or not this first under-ice abyss voyage ever really happens, the act of imagining it stretches us. It reminds us that our ingenuity is vast, but that the ocean's mystery is vaster still, that some parts of Earth will always feel slightly out of reach. And as we drift here, in this possible future, another question quietly rises from the dark below. What if the ocean is already sending us messages back, in ways we've barely learned to hear. Soft landing, bringing the ocean back to your room. So if the ocean is already whispering back, we can let those messages fade to a softer murmur and begin our return. For a moment longer, stay with me in the dark. Then, when you're ready, follow me as we turn gently upward, leaving the instruments and the imagined submarine behind, and begin to rise through the cold water toward the ice above. We move slowly at first, as if our bodies have become as light as the drifting snow on the surface, and the immense pressure that once wrapped around us is loosening layer by layer, like a deep exhale from the earth itself. We pass the depth where steel hulls hesitate, then the quiet threshold where the pressure zone ends, and ordinary submarines would feel safe again. And still we keep drifting upward, through a world that is becoming less strange and more familiar with every meter. Above us, the underside of the ice comes into view, a pale rippled ceiling, like the inside of a frozen cave, green and blue light filtering through in soft, uneven patches. Imagine our last bubbles of breath slipping up to meet it, flattening against that hidden roof, then sliding sideways along melt channels that have been carved over years by water, just a little warmer than its surroundings. Now picture what happens as we reach that boundary ourselves. We press against the ice, feel it thin, feel it brighten, and then, with almost no sound at all, we break through. On the other side is air, cold, polar air that tastes clean and sharp, an invisible ocean above the ice. We rise again, away from the flows and the pressure ridges and the distant shape of any glacier, past the night sky over the Arctic, past clouds and continents, until that whole frozen place is just a memory we're carrying. And then, very gently, we come back down, not into another extreme environment, but into your own quiet room. Make yourself comfortable here, as if you're settling onto the seafloor of your everyday life, familiar and steady. Let your attention land on small details. The way the fabric beneath your hand feels against your skin, the pattern of shadow and light on the wall, the faint hum of a heater, a fan, or the distant sounds outside that you usually ignore. These are your anchors after a long journey beneath the ice. Simple signals that you are safe at the surface. Notice your breathing now. Inhale, slowly, and feel your chest rise like a gentle swell crossing the ocean. Exhale and let it fall again, like a wave sliding back down a beach, unhurried. We're going to let each breath be a tide, coming in and going out, steady, predictable, shaped by invisible forces that have been at work for millions of years. If your thoughts try to race ahead, just slow your thoughts the way the water slows under winter ice, calm and dense and clear. We often picture exploration as something urgent and loud, all engines and countdowns, but it can also be this: you, lying here, letting hidden worlds drift a little closer in your imagination. If you'd like, you can carry this feeling into other nights, other journeys, as we keep visiting places on Earth that feel almost alien, and worlds far beyond that echo with the same quiet mysteries. In a moment, we'll offer a gentle way for you to keep traveling with us, not as an obligation, but as an open door you can step through whenever you're ready. A world that begins where we end. Final reflections. So as that open door lingers in your mind, make yourself comfortable again, and let's turn very gently toward the heart of what we've been circling all this time. We've followed ice and instruments and ideas, but beneath all of that, there is a very simple picture we can hold on to. We often picture the Arctic Ocean as a flat white disk on a map, a blank circle at the top of the world, as if the only boundary that matters is the edge of the page. But somewhere far below the ice, under the cold ceiling of the North Pole, there is another kind of edge, drawn not in ink or politics, but in invisible weight. There is a depth where our submarines, with all their careful engineering, with their steel and sometimes titanium skins, simply stop going. Now picture what happens as you follow me downward in your imagination. With every 10 meters, the pressure rises by about 1 atmosphere. Another full layer of the air you're breathing now stacked on top of you. Again and again, until, at a few hundred meters, the hull of a modern submarine is already carrying more strain than we can comfortably imagine. There is a test depth, and below that a red line, a crush depth, where the ocean would no longer negotiate. What lies beyond that line is not a secret base or a hidden fleet. It is something quieter. It is water that has never felt the sound of a propeller. A cold, dark place beneath the ice where our maps grow vague and our machines become rare visitors if they appear at all. At the Malloy Deep, more than 5.5 kilometers down, the Arctic becomes almost entirely itself again. This boundary is not a border we can move with a treaty or erase with a new app on a bright screen. It is written by physics, by the way molecules press together, by the limits of metal and composite and human nerve. Not because we lack courage, but because the Earth itself, and the pressure of its oceans, asks us to stop. There is something strangely calming in that, isn't there? In a world where technology so often feels like it is everywhere, all the time, it can be a relief to remember that most of the planet is still resistant, still deep, still beyond what we can comfortably occupy. The ice, the glacier, the dark water beneath, they have their own timelines, their own quiet. If you'd like, you can slow your thoughts just enough to carry a small piece of that awareness with you. The next time you see an image of the North Pole, or a bright satellite view of white spread across the top of the Earth, you might remember that under that surface lies a vast hidden realm, layered with pressure and darkness and years of untouched history, some of which may remain partly unknown for as long as we're here. Thank you for sharing this long, slow journey with us, not because any algorithm pushed you here, but because your own curiosity wanted to follow a thread into the cold and the deep. We're going to leave the pressure zone now, but the ocean keeps going without us. And in our next travels together, we'll keep listening for other places where the world quietly says, "This is where you end, and I begin." A quiet invitation to keep drifting together. So before we fully let go of this cold, quiet place, while the last images of ice and darkness are still moving gently in your mind, we're going to leave you with a small question to drift on. If you're still awake, if your eyes are still open or half closed, following the slow motion of the water, imagine you could nudge our curiosity in one direction. Where would you push exploration next? Farther out into deep space, farther down into the deep ocean, or sideways into the hidden channels beneath the polar ice? And why that one of all the worlds we haven't reached yet? If you feel like sharing, you can make yourself comfortable. Let your thoughts wander for a moment, and then write a few quiet words in the comments, so we can see the different paths our curiosity wants to take. We often picture the internet as a loud, bright surface, always asking for more noise, more speed, more pressure to react. This channel is meant to be a different kind of place, a small, dimly lit corner where we can slow your thoughts and let questions take years if they need to. If you found some comfort in this slow exploration, if the idea of a world beneath the ice helped you rest, then subscribing or leaving a gentle like is one way of helping this tiny, calm space on the surface of the web keep existing. But there is no need to do anything now, not because it doesn't matter, but because your body and your mind matter more. You can let the video end without touching a single button. You can drift into sleep with the sound still fading. Or you can simply lie there in the dark, resting with these pictures of ice ceilings, black water, and the deep, unseen pressure that waits far below the hull of any submarine. If you do return, on some later night, we're going to keep following these threads into other hidden places. Maybe we'll listen in on the quiet technology race to build under-ice systems that can survive the abyss, or travel, in our thoughts, along the buried rivers that run beneath Antarctic ice, carving secret valleys and lakes no one has ever seen. Now, picture what happens when we treat those spaces not as conquests, but as neighbors we approach slowly, carefully, almost on tiptoe. For now, though, we'll leave them alone. Outside your room, night is still wrapped around the earth, and somewhere far away the pressure zone waits, untouched, a dark boundary between our world and its own. As you close your eyes, you can let that boundary stay where it is, a quiet line in the cold, and know that it will still be there tomorrow, and the next night, and all the nights after, keeping its deep, patient watch while you rest.